we go. Okay. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events. And today we have a special Crooked Lane quartet of crime writers. Let me see here. I'll go alphabetically. First, we have Andrew Bourelle. This brand new book here, 48 Hours to Kill. Sorry, I was reading the first one here. Here's a copy of that right here. And then, you know, I probably should have established the correct pronunciation of your names, but I'm just going to wing it. Richard Chiapponi, is that close?
It's close.
How do you say it?
I just say Chiappone, make it simple.
Chiapponi. All right. Here's his brand new book, The Hunger of Crows. And then we have Robert Justice with They Can't Take Your Name right here. Beautiful cover. And then finally, Claire Kells, her book here, Vanishing Edge. And we do have some signed copies of this one. And I'll go ahead and put up links to all four of the books in the comments field, should you wish to purchase one. And I'm going to hand it over to Barbara, but if anybody has questions, go ahead and put them in the comments field or the chat function on YouTube. And she'll summon me back towards the end of the hour, and I'll be happy to ask any of your questions. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. You'd think I had magical powers, but it's actually just Zoom. And anyway, it's a pleasure to meet all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Crooked Lane is an interesting publisher. They have a very cozy mystery side, but they also publish thrillers. So we have done from time to time a joint event with groups of authors, either on the cozy side or on the thriller side. And it's fun. I do it. What I'd like to do is ask each one of you to give us a synopsis, pitch, whatever you want to say about your individual book. And then there's some general topics that we can talk about, because all of you have some things in common, and then everybody has things that make their books different. So I'm going to stick to the alphabetical order thing, because, you know, there's no really fair way to do this, is there? So Andrew, that puts you up first.
All right, thank you. Thanks so much for doing this. I love Poison Pen. I come to Arizona at least once a year and always stop in. I really love the bookstore, so this is really special for me. My book is 48 Hours to Kill, and the premise of the book is pretty simple. There's a prison inmate, and he's given a 48-hour furlough to attend his sister's funeral, and he decides to use that 48 hours to try to find her killer. The police and FBI have been looking for weeks and have not solved her murder, but he's going to attempt to do it in 48 hours. And being a former, I guess he's a criminal, he's maybe has some methods that aren't available to the police and the FBI and those in law enforcement. So he's got to kind of return to his criminal roots to be able to try, to be able to try to solve the crime.
That's really interesting. You've made him kind of an amateur sleuth, but he's actually a criminal in prison. I love that. It's a very interesting combination. So good for you. Richard, I would say if you were Italian, I'd pronounce it what? Chiappone? But I'm not sure how you pronounce it.
My folks Americanized the name. They wanted to be Ozzy and Harriet, you know, and so we just say Chiappone. But in Sicily, it would be Chiappone. It's a little.
Okay.
I have some extra letters in there. I really need Marie Kondo to come in and clean them out.
Let me hold it up. I just want to make sure that people can actually, where is it? Way at the bottom, can actually see your name.
All right. Okay.
I don't know if you all know the author John Lesquire. His name is spelled Lescroart, which is Irish, and it's pronounced Lesquire. But he has a hilarious story he tells about an event he was invited to in San Francisco. And he gave his name as John Lesquire. And when he arrived, to his amazement, I mean, he's a bestseller, but they had like a staggering table full of books. And, you know, it looked absolutely huge. And it all turned out in the end, they thought he was John Le Carre because of the name thing. So he loves to tell that story on himself. It can be, if you have an unusual name, I think it's always good to, you know, make sure people understand it. Anyway, Richard, tell us about The Hunger of Crows. And I will tell you, just to make you nervous, that Dana Stabenow is sitting out in the living room playing with my puppies, ready to have dinner.
Oh, Tina. She's a good friend from right here in Alaska, where I am right now. Yeah.
Right. So you set your
Where are
book in Homer, or at least you're kicking it off in Homer, and Dana lives there.
Yeah, I'm in Homer at the moment. Where are you, Barbara?
I'm in Scottsdale in my office at home.
Scottsdale in Arizona.
Mhm.
Oh, wonderful. All right. So Dana is there.
Dana winters with us every year. She's here for a couple of months.
Ah, it's a smart
Looking
move.
over the weather forecast, I might add. She has a weather forecast thing and shows me pictures of it's like 2 below zero and 20 feet of snow. And
Yeah,
we're
it's been-
having an al fresco lunch. Anyway, I digress. Tell us about your book.
So, The Hunger of Crows is a story of Carla Marino, a divorced cocktail waitress, suddenly worried about approaching 40 years old. To keep herself feeling young, Carla picks up men in bars for meaningless sex, but a one-night stand goes bad when she hooks up with a guy named Cosmo D'Angelo, who is a former CIA gunman with a secret that he will kill to protect. Fleeing her home in Phoenix, Arizona, where she lives and has most of her life, Carla drives more than 4,000 miles until she runs out of road in the small coastal town of Homer, Alaska, a seemingly perfect hiding place. Unfortunately, in today's digitally connected world, no place is truly safe from a professional assassin with military-grade search capabilities.
That's it. All right. Well, Robert Justice, your book, contrastingly, is set in Denver, in Denver's Black community. So yours is an urban setting.
It is. 5 Points is the heart of Denver's Black community, and it's about 3 people. We have Eli Stone, who is a grieving man. He's brokenhearted. He has lost his wife, and he's literally living underground when we meet him. He's renovating a jazz club, trying to occupy his time. And when one day in through the door walks Liza, and Liza is a desperate daughter. She's given up everything, her singing career, her dreams, to go back to law school and fight for her father's freedom. And then her father is Langston Brown. He has been wrongfully convicted of the Mother's Day massacre. He has 30 days to live, and these 3 stories come together.
Denver has some wonderful bookstores. I mean, the Tattered Cover is an absolutely legendary bookstore, but it doesn't have, and I find this true of Phoenix too, where I live, doesn't have as high a proportion of authors as you might expect, at least in the mystery community, as compared to, say, Boston or Seattle or even Minneapolis. Do you think there's a reason for that?
I think oftentimes you think of mystery novels being set in New York, Chicago, LA, those kind of things, and Denver is kind of left out. And I'm hoping that myself, and there's a few others, I think of David Heska Wanbley Wyden, who wrote Winter Counts last year, and he's based here in Denver. And there's a few more of us, Patricia Raybon. So we're trying to represent.
I work hard on trying to get more authors in Metro Phoenix and Scottsdale. We have a lot of romance authors and so forth, but for some reason the crime, maybe there's something about all that sunshine that just discourages crime. I'm not really sure. Well, Claire, I'm going to call you Claire. Vanishing Edge appealed to us because we have such a long history with Nevada Bar and with Christine Carbo and Scott Graham. In other words, the national park thing has always really flourished here at the Poison Pen. So tell us a little bit about your book.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this one is set in Sequoia National Park. It features an investigative duo. Harland she's an ISB agent, so used to be an FBI, but she really specializes in crimes in national parks. And then she's joined by a park ranger, Hux, who, he's like this, good looking, handsome, like kind of fun guy. So there's a little bit of tension there, and they have good witty banter. It's an important part of the story is their relationship, because she has some demons and he's kind of her support, but also trying to learn the ropes. And this story is really investigating at first the mysterious disappearance of a glamper, which is like luxury camping. So telling the story of, just the really fancy camping outfits that happen a lot these days. And so they look into that, and as they investigate further, it takes some twisty turns. It turns into a murder. There's some bodies, and it becomes a whodunit for them. So, yeah.
Well, Sequoia Park is an interesting park. Was it threatened a lot by the recent fires?
It was in some respects. Yeah, I was in the Bay Area for 12 years, and I spent a lot of time in like the Tahoe National Forest. And so while I was there, I mean, every fall for the last like 5 years, it would just be a big event, which is the fires. It became kind of a way of life, especially I was in San Francisco. We just moved recently, but it was always there. And I think, you know, just living in that setting and having that happen every year, and also being up in the Tahoe National Forest and the just Lake Tahoe, spending time up there. I think it's just such a rich setting. I just became enamored with it, the mystery of it, just the vastness of it. So it felt like an interesting place to set it.
It is an interesting place. I was a Stanford undergraduate, and I can remember, because this is a really long time ago, because I graduated in '62, that the sequoias were, you know, we used to go up and visit them around Tamalpais, and there's, you know, and they were just so gorgeous and so amazing. I'm from Chicago, so I'd never seen anything, you know, like a sequoia, and I worried during the fires that we're gonna lose them. So I'm glad that you set your book there. Right, so I have some interesting questions. Well, I hope they're interesting, but anyway, I think it's perfectly clear from the title of Andrew's book, 48 Hours to Kill, and then we've also heard from Mr. Justice, that you guys, to make a thriller really click along, oftentimes authors want to introduce a ticking clock. My dear friend Jeffrey Deaver is like a master of the ticking clock. Sometimes these books are called, like, you know, 2 minutes to midnight or something. So Andrew and Robert, you want to talk to us about the ticking clock mechanism? Why did you guys decide to power your books with that?
Andrew, feel free.
You know, I just always like ticking clock books, thrillers that have a sort of countdown. I think it always sort of amps up the pressure. I always feel in my life stressed and, you know, tense when my own clocks are ticking toward deadlines, or even just trying to get the kids out of the school on time to make it to the school bus. It's as the clock comes closer to the time, you're feeling really stressed out. So so I wanted to do that. I wanted to try it. I thought somewhere along the lines, I had this idea of a criminal who would be the protagonist. And I thought, well, what about a prisoner who's out on furlough and he's only got 48 hours to solve the crime? So that's what I had in mind as I was doing it.
How about you, Robert?
It wasn't something that I initially thought of when I was writing it. It was like in second or third draft where I realized it was even there. It was just something that felt natural to increase the stakes, but it wasn't on purpose until I saw it, and then I kind of refined it a little bit more throughout the story. But especially when you have somebody's life on the line, that gives you a reason to turn the page to find out what happens.
Well, absolutely. A ticking clock definitely accelerates the pace, or at least it keeps it turning as you're working towards a goal. And I mean, a good thriller, you know, is really, it's a duel. Generally, it's a duel between, you know, the protagonist and the antagonist. And in fact, a thriller, I think, often depends more on the quality of the bad guy, the antagonist, than it does on the quality of the hero. But you can debate that. But definitely, if you've got a time thing so that the story can't meander or everybody can relax, it does keep up the pace. And do you both think that people read thrillers because they like turning the pages quickly? What do you think? I need to name you, right? It's too hard, right? Sorry. Robert, what do you think about that? And then we'll go back to Andrew.
I mean, gosh, I don't know. I think people read it for any number of reasons. I think there's something about the characters when they get latched onto them. They want to know what happens to them. And there are some people who major on short chapters and quick turning. There are others who can capture you at the beginning with a hook, and then they just take you on a slow burn throughout, and you don't feel like it's a page turner, but you definitely feel engaged. And so I think both can work. And I've enjoyed both of them.
Well, you can, but I mean, you had to choose one or the other to write your story. And so
I went with short chapters and a ticking clock.
Yeah. Right. I mean, that's kind of the James Patterson or Jeffrey Deaver, you know, kind of approach to it. How about you, Andrew?
Yeah, kind of the same. I think that, I mean, it's always talked about in terms of a compliment. It's a page turner. Couldn't stop turning the pages. I read it so quickly. And I think that's a lot of people really love that. I think there's also a real value in, like Robert was saying, slow burn where you just kind of get into it and you kind of feel this tension. I think often those books you can read fast as well too if the prose is really good and the narrative's great. Doesn't have to be designed to be the page turner. But yeah, I consciously made the decision for this book. I thought I'm going to really try to create a tense 48-hour period and see what I could do.
Often, I hear the word page turner applied to thrillers as though that, is a real plus. And I mean, it can be for some readers, but I don't know that I necessarily am always attracted. A lot of it depends, what you want to read can often depend on your mood. I mean, don't most of us have like a stack of books and one of them feels more than another at any given moment? Sometimes you want to go fast and sometimes you just don't. So anyway, I think it's fascinating. Richard, let's talk to you a little bit about landscape, because I do think you've got a small town. Claire has got a national park, and then we have, a prison setting and so forth. Did you pick a small town? Why did you pick a small town for your setting? And then the rugged landscape of Alaska beyond the small town.
This story started as a short story in a collection I wrote in 2010, or published in 2010, and in it was just a story of a woman in a small town in coastal Alaska and a man, and it's just a coming together of the two. And it didn't go very far or anywhere. Short stories are like that sometimes, and it never felt really complete. And so I got back into it years later, and I basically spent the last 6 or 7 years rewriting it, making it into a novel, because I'm a short story writer at heart. These books behind me are almost all short story collections or anthologies. So this was the first time I attempted a novel. Oh, actually, I think I attempted a few that didn't get very far, but this is the first time I've published a novel. And yeah, it was, the landscape is a big part of it. And for me, I noticed that now, going back and reading it, this is not something that I was thinking about as I was writing it, but I'm noticing that the landscape plays a part in the plot of the story. For example, not giving too much away, in Alaska right now, we have pretty short days. Dana can tell you that right now it's dark until 9 or 10 in the morning. It'll be dark again at 5 this afternoon. But in the summer, it's just the opposite. Here, even in Homer, which is 220 miles south of Anchorage, we're very far south in Alaska, so we don't have the extreme daylight issues like up in northern parts. So in the story, Carla is hiding from this dangerous character who is tracking her from Phoenix, Arizona, is where the story starts. And the constant daylight is creating a problem for her. So it becomes part of the pressure. You talked about the pressure in Andre's book and in Robert's book. And in this case, it's the daylight adds to it. So that's a way of using the setting as part of the conflict.
It's interesting. I mean, last night we did an event for Paige Shelton, her Wild Alaska series, which again has the small town in Alaska, and it's a place where people can either they're local and they have deep-rooted secrets and deep-rooted loyalties and so forth, or in the case of Paige's protagonist, she's hiding, and it appears that in a remote town she can manage to do that. Connor Sullivan wrote a book similarly this summer set in rural Yukon in Alaska, and who's a Kelly Armstrong has a town called Brockton, or is it Rockton? Maybe it's Rockton, in a small town in the Yukon, again, where people can hide. So I think it's interesting, that combination of small town and hiding plays a role that seems to attract people to. Maybe Alaska seems like a really remote place to all of us, and therefore a logical place for people to go if they're wanting to hide from evil characters wishing to do them harm.
Well, there's a lot of us hiding from our past here, that's for sure. There's no doubt about that. We're hiding from our relatives and our ex-wives and, any number of things. But the small town is a bit of a conundrum because although it's off the beaten path, the very smallness of it makes you stand out. It's harder it would be easier to disappear in Chicago or New York than it is in a small town like Homer.
I agree. I mean, I think, if you're looking for a witness protection setting, which one would you pick? The anonymity of a larger place or the remoteness of a smaller place that comes into play. So Claire, when you decided to do national, what is it that pulled you into doing a national park? And are you intending to explore other national parks?
Yeah. To answer your first question, well, my first book, which was kind of a mismatch of genres, published about 5-6 years ago, was set in the wilderness in Colorado. I'm just really obsessed with dark, scary woods. I mean, I can't explain why that is. I think there's something suspenseful and like scary and unknown about it and wild. And I just love that setting. I'm really drawn to it. And so I think the national parks was an obvious choice for me. It was almost like a natural gravitation. And so with Sequoia, I think it was just being in California for all that time and just being really just in love with that part of the state. As much as I enjoy San Francisco and lived in the heart of it for 12 years, I just never felt compelled to really write in the heart of the city. It just wasn't, I don't know, maybe someday. But yes, it's the first in a planned series, or at least I'm working on the next book now, so that'll come out next year. And the plan would be to kind of move around to different national parks, but I'm also toying with the idea of establishing some characters in the California setting. I mean, I think there's a lot to build on there. So, and that appeals to me too, because I'm very character driven. Once I get into their lives, I like to kind of stick with them a little bit. But certainly kind of stick with that milieu of the national parks.
Well, California has a lot of national and state parks, which is, helpful. But it's an interesting combination because, you've got the small town thing Richard and I were just talking about, but because there's a constant influx of visitors and rotation among the rangers and so forth, you can avoid the Cabot Cove syndrome of, why are so many people being murdered in Sequoia National Park? I mean, it's just not realistic, right? And then also park rangers have some interesting range of duties. Nevada and I have been friends forever. I mean, we went through her entire series from beginning to end until she decided that Anna Pigeon had reached an age where the physical punishment that she was having to absorb in the books was just too much. And so she retired her. But it's also true, I think, of Christine Carbo in her books in Glacier. Not so much true of Scott. So if you're going to do a series, you've got some really good things to work with. I assume you've thought that out.
I have thought that out. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's setting and it's also character. I really enjoy spending time with the two main characters. I think there's a levity to them that adds to the story, and that I just enjoy being around them. It's not all doom and gloom. I mean, I love thrillers and mysteries of all types. It's more for me as a writer. I think I gravitate towards that humorous element too. And so spending time with them just sounds fun. And I hope I get to write more books.
Well, I hope you do too. So Robert, we've been talking about small town, but in fact, a prison is a small town, if you really think about it. And also the Black community in Denver is a small town within a larger town. So, do you find that your book, by choosing the 5 Points area, you got the benefits of both kinds? You got the urban landscape and the small town one?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah, you have this localized neighborhood where 5 Points is this beautiful historic neighborhood where for 30, 40, 100 years, Blacks have found churches and doctors and lawyers and barbers. Lately, gentrification has taken place and that neighborhood's changing a lot. But yes, it was a confined neighborhood where many things were found, and safety was found as well.
And over here to you, Andrew. I mean, the same thing, really. Prison is in effect a small town, but with an influx of inmates, depending on how fast it all turns over, you can achieve a certain amount of mobility. But you wouldn't choose necessarily to write a second book set in a prison with the same guy, would you?
No, and he spends most of the book out of prison. It takes place in the Reno area in Nevada, which is kind of it's not a small town, but it's not a major city either. The biggest little city in the world. It kind of has, when I was thinking of setting, I thought, it has a smallish feel as opposed to something like Las Vegas, but still has a lot of the kind of like noir elements you might think. It's got gambling, prostitution's legal in Nevada. It's got vast expanses of desert. There's Lake Tahoe nearby where you could imagine gangsters going to dump a body. So it, thinking about a setting, I mean, I had lived there, that's why I chose it, but I always thought it was kind of a perfect setting for a crime thriller that, and I didn't want to write something in a major city, but I thought kind of, a smallish, but still place where you could imagine kind of like these seedy elements.
Well, before we move on to characters and my comment about you need a really great antagonist to make a good thriller, I see Patrick rejoined us, so you must have something you want to contribute, Pete.
Yeah, well, for one thing, I just wanted to, does anybody know somebody named Susan Robbins who is trying to get into the Zoom?
I do. I know.
All right.
She's in Phoenix.
Oh, okay. I kicked her out, so can
Right.
you have her?
Zoom links are only for the authors in case it ever comes up again. You create a security issue.
Yeah, so she can watch the program on our Facebook Live or our YouTube thing. Otherwise, she would be on the screen with all of us, and so we decided it's easier. But yeah, I do have some questions.
Okay.
First of all, for Claire, I was reading a little bit about your background, and you're one of those rare people that has both lobes fully functioning. I read that you studied English literature, and then you got a medical degree, and you're a doctor. Can you talk a little bit about how those combination of different skills sort of inform your writing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think being a doctor there's so much narrative to it. I really enjoy there's a lot of mystery, actually, like sitting down with a patient and trying to sort through the history and get through the questions I need to know, the answers I need to know to get to the answer. I really love that aspect of it. And I think that informs my storytelling in a way that I can really do a deep dive into character while also keeping an eye out for what makes them vulnerable. And, certainly Vanishing Edge, I mean, the protagonist has some injuries in her past, some medical issues and things that she's trying to deal with physically as she traipses through this rugged terrain. And so it was helpful to have that background. But I love being able to kind of explore something creatively and then have medicine be part of my life too. I think they go naturally together. And I feel fortunate that I have both of them in my life. I think it's been great. And writing this book, I got really lucky because I was on jury duty for 2 weeks. And so where I was employed at the time, they weren't allowed to schedule patients for me in case I got called. I never got called, but I didn't have any patients for 2 weeks. So that's when I really wrote the bulk of the novel.
Right.
So
So, if you think about it, House was basically, Sherlock Holmes with a stethoscope. I mean, if you watch House, the medical thing, he was really a determined investigator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, and then I'm going to move on, but I wanted to ask you a little bit, Claire, I read that you're an avid open water swimmer, which sounds terrifying. Can you talk about that a little bit? And what does that mean? Do you go out in the ocean or lakes or just wherever?
Yeah, I've done them all. In the swimming community, it's not cool to wear a wetsuit. So I've definitely done cold water swims in the 50s. During COVID, the pools were closed. So I swam in the San Francisco Bay with no wetsuit with my husband.
It's pretty sharky out there, isn't it?
I'm sorry?
It's pretty sharky out there, isn't it?
It's very sharky. Yes. It was scary. I swam across, as Andrew had said, I have done Lake Tahoe. I've swum across Lake Tahoe with a relay a couple times, thought about the bodies at the bottom of the lake. And I've done, I love it. It just feeds my soul. I think it will continue to surface in all of my novels, as it did a little bit in this one, much more in my debut. But
that was Girl Underwater, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
There is a lake and there is some swimming featured in that one. So I'm just, it's a passion of mine. I make time for it in addition to the writing and the medicine and the family. Again, I don't do any of these things exceptionally well, but I try to keep them all in my life. So keep things going. Yeah.
Wow, swimming across San Francisco Bay, that's what kept people in Alcatraz. I'm really amazed that you would consider it's just so damn dangerous. So let's talk about antagonists. You guys, to write these books, you had to come up with a lead character, but you also had to come up with the bad guys. So which was harder for you? Which one? Robert, what do you, how did it work for you?
The antagonist in my story, his name is Detective Slager, and he's a bad cop in Denver. And in part, I was trying to show that in Denver, we have, Denver's a beautiful place to live, but is everybody here living beautifully? And I'm just trying to look underneath the layers of this beautiful city. And when it comes to policing, we have the same problems here that, other places have, but maybe we're not making the news, though as of late we have been. But I had written a caricature of a bad cop. It was a white cop who was just causing havoc, and it didn't make sense in the story until my detective who is causing the trouble, I also made him black. And so now we have him in 5 Points, a black man who became a cop for good reasons, but has been doing bad things along the way. And he became a very textured character who adds to the story. And so, yeah, once I made that one shift that he is just like everyone else in 5 Points, then nuance became something that was a part of the story.
Yeah, but I mean, to really have a potent story, you need to have a serious threat, and the serious threat generally emanates from the antagonist, the bad guy, the villain, whatever it is. So Andrew, what did you decide? How did you conceive of your bad people?
Well, the main antagonist in my book is the sort of crime boss that the protagonist used to work for before he went to prison, and the protagonist went to prison for a longer sentence by keeping his silence and not ratting this guy out. But when he gets out of prison, he thinks that his old crime boss is probably the one responsible for the murder of his sister. And so it was kind of fun because it allowed me to create not just this guy, but a whole cast of villains who are, essentially his henchmen. The people that do his bidding, the kind of people that the protagonist used to be. He used to be sort of the guy's right-hand man, and now he's gone to prison and been replaced by a new crew. And so he's, a gangster who started as a loan shark and who, an offense for stolen goods and money laundering, and has graduated over time as to, a full-fledged crime boss. So it was fun to try to create such a person and still make them not, entirely cartoonish, and still make them seem like a real person, a sociopath who runs a crime organization, but still someone that feels layered and complex. And so it was a lot of fun to write. And I mean, most of the characters in my book are probably bad in some degree. Even the protagonist is in prison. So it was to make him truly threatening and scary was a fun task to attempt.
You make an excellent point about avoiding the cartoonish. I mean, to be a great protagonist, it needs to be believable. I remember watching Goldfinger again years after it originally came out, and I thought, seriously, who would actually take Goldfinger seriously? I can't even imagine it. So, Richard, you've enlisted real professionals in your band team there.
Yes, I sat down intentionally to write a thriller or a compelling book. Actually, I sat down to write a book that people would actually buy, as opposed to my short story collections. So I didn't have a lot of experience with plot. Short stories, the stories that I like, Chekhov and Carver and those kinds of things, don't have a lot of plot. So I intentionally started out trying to make it a page turner. So I knew I had this woman in a small town being pursued for someone. She was hiding for someone, and I had to find someone for her to hide from. So that she came first, and then the villain or the antagonist came second. And this guy's name is Cosmo D'Angelo. He's an Italian-American guy, mid-40s. He comes from Buffalo, New York, where I grew up for the first 30 years of my life. And I guess at first I thought he would be, as I think Andrew was saying, just kind of a sociopath or maybe a psychopath. Why do men hurt women? Well, there's a lot of bad guys out there who do terrible things. So that would have been a simple way. But as I started writing this guy, I made the mistake of like falling in love with my characters, all of my characters. So the book ballooned out. It got huge, and it was all this backstory about every one of my. There's 4 points of view in the book, and man, it was just like hundreds of pages that had to be finally thrown out. But in the end, I have an antagonist who's very complex. He doesn't really have anything personally against the Carla character. He's kind of driven by a type of honor, actually, for connected to his military duty that he had. He was a longtime special ops guy, and then he worked for the CIA in what they call a ground branch. When the CIA needs protection in a foreign country, they have to bring in military guys for that. And some of the story takes place and has to do with the drug enforcement down in Colombia in the 90s. So Cosmo D'Angelo is a very complex character, and he's an insane foodie. He's a real food snob, and he's always looking for a next meal, and he cooks like crazy. So he's a wonderful character. I love him. He's my favorite character in the book, and he's the quote unquote bad guy.
I think he's really a fascinating character, and it's important if you want to create the kind of story that you did, that he has a skill set that is believable, that he can actually do the things you want him to do. You can't just pick some guy up, a teacher in an elementary school or something, and turn him into a villain with appropriate skills. So good job.
Well, I don't have those skills myself. I was never in that line of work. I think the last time I shot a gun was probably at a squirrel in about 1970, But I talked to a former military person who can't even tell me exactly what it is he did, but he explained how some of those things work. So it was I had to do some research for that part of it, because I'm no gunslinger, that's for sure.
Well, it's called fiction. You don't actually have to be the person that you're writing about. So, Claire, you have 2 potential villains in your book. I mean, you've got Mother Nature, who can be actually the most dangerous of all. And then who else have you created to make your thriller work?
I have a host of characters that are shady. And I think for me, I set out in some ways to write a true mystery, to have it be a whodunit. I read a lot of those growing up. Like my mom and I always read Mary Higgins Clark. We just love to try to guess who did it by the end. I think has built-in suspense, and that was pretty much what I set out to do. I will say I really didn't know who did it myself until well into several drafts. So, and I think that was just fun, exploring that and kind of discovering the story through revision and figuring out who was behind it all. But I think your antagonist still has to have some motive that feels true and feels like emotionally honest. And so through the book and through revisions, once I had that all figured out, I certainly wanted to build that in so that the reader doesn't feel cheated at the end, and feels like the story in every way stays true to all the characters. I do have many that I hope readers will appreciate as suspects and have fun guessing, but that's kind of how I built it.
Well, you did have a complex cast, which I really like. I want to move on quickly to relationships and partnerships, but Patrick, you're still here. So what would you like to ask?
I'm still here. Yeah, I actually have a bunch of stuff. I'd like to ask Robert, as far as the subject of villains, it strikes me as your villain could be the entire damn system. You deal with a lot of these themes, wrongful convictions and, mass incarceration. And I think out here in the Southwest of, the prison for profit culture, especially out here, it's crazy. Can you talk just a little bit about that? I mean, there are a lot of deep issues that you're exploring in your work. Can you tell us a little bit about the series?
Yeah, the system is a secondary villain in this. For as long as I can remember, for all of my adult life, I have been absolutely heartbroken over the wrongfully convicted. I just can't imagine what would happen to any of us if one day we are just plucked off the street and we are put in prison for something we didn't do. And our system, conservative estimates are that 2 to 3% of convictions in America are wrong, which is not a bad rate percentage wise, but that's thousands of people a year who are in prison doing time for crimes they did not commit. And so I just wanted to explore, why does this happen? And for me, I think you can just say wrongful convictions happen because of our wrongful convictions. And that's what I'm trying to explore in this series of novels. And for me, I'm even writing these for a purpose where I'm calling it Read a Book, Right or Wrong, that the proceeds from this series of books is going to go to the Corey Wise Innocence Project at CU Boulder, hoping that maybe someday we can walk somebody out of prison who shouldn't be there.
Wow. And can you talk just briefly about, about the importance of jazz? I mean, it's a huge question, but you look back at the lives of a lot of the classic jazz musicians, and there are some real noir stories all throughout jazz history, the very American art form. Why did you choose to incorporate that into your work?
Well, one, I do love jazz, and I love listening to it, and it's the soundtrack of my life and my writing. In 5 Points in Denver, you have 5 different streets coming together, creating the name of the neighborhood, 5 Points. At the intersection, there is an historic jazz club known as the Rossonian, which I call in my book the Roz. And it was the place where people came together. It was also the place where when I think Billie Holiday and her like came through town, they would play and make their money in downtown Denver, but then they couldn't stay there. They couldn't stay in the hotels, and they would have to come to 5 Points, which is just 5 minutes to the east. And so they would play again in 5 Points at the Rossonian, but then also have a place to sleep at night. And so they play for free and be in a place that was safe. And so jazz is the history of America in music. So
right, Walter Mosley, famously kind of showed us the LA that we really hadn't seen before in fiction. We knew Raymond Chandler's LA, we knew, Nathaniel West's LA, whatever. But he took us down into the Central Avenue scene and showed us, the jazz clubs. And it's interesting how he used it over time. Was he an influence to you at all, or an inspiration?
Walter Mosley, as you mentioned him, and I love one thing Walter Mosley said. He said, if we don't exist in the literature, we didn't exist in history. And that's a driving force behind these novels for me, is that Denver does have a Black community. We are 12% of the population. We are here. And many of the things that we see in LA and Chicago when it comes to that literature, I just want it to happen here as well, and just put us on the map even when it comes to the history of literature. Right.
Now, several of you, I'm thinking Andrew and Richard, have written lots of short stories. I don't know if you have, Robert or Claire,
No.
or if it's just the long form, but Andrew, you've published a lot, and you were in the Best American Short Stories, and also, I don't think we've mentioned that you've, written a couple of books with James Patterson, the, Texas Ranger, and I think, what was the other one? Texas Outlaw.
Yeah.
What was that experience like? He's been a real steward, helping out other writers. What was that like?
Yeah, it's funny. It really just fell into my lap because of my short story writing. I had a short story published, I guess, 2014, and he was the guest editor of the Best American Mystery Stories 2015, and he picked my story and then got in touch with me afterward and said, I've got this. That story is kind of a modern day Western, sort of a shootout between some Montana cowboys and some meth dealers. But I think he thought the sort of the tone was kind of right for this Texas Ranger book he was envisioning. So he asked me to work on that. So it was just, kind of fell into my lap, but it was great, amazing opportunity. I mean, I loved every minute of it. I didn't really know what to expect, but I just had a blast working with him. So
was that your first experience writing a long form narrative, a book length project?
I have my first novel is a literary coming of age book called Heavy Metal. It was published by Autumn House Press, a small indie publisher. So I had a full draft of that at that point. And so I had been sort of transitioning, trying to write novel length works, but working with Jim really helped me transition and see novels in a different way. I think my first book feels like a long short story. It's it's a week in the life of a teenager in the 1980s. A depressed teenager who steals his dad's gun and gets into trouble. But anyway, but still a week in the life of a teenager.
Autobiographical, I assume.
And so
no comment.
Anyway, no. I mean, it's kind of based where I grew up, but not autobiographical. Anyway, so I've since transitioned sort of out of writing stories, and when I try to write a story now, I have so much trouble. I do sort of think in the long form now, and if someone might ask me to write a story and say keep it under 5,000 words, and I think, how do you do that? I used to do it all the time, and now it just seems impossible to write something so short.
Right.
Working with Jim has been, like writer's school for any number of co-authors. Oftentimes it's an established author that brings something like Mike Lupica. We're doing an event with Jim. We've done a lot of events with Jim under Zoom and some in the store. And his range of co-authors is really interesting. Occasionally, they're well established. Sometimes they're less well known, and it always has an effect on their writing. So
yeah,
Clive Cussler did the same. Clive had co-authors, and they all, because we were his bookstore for 30 years until he died, and the co-authors always said that writing with him was like a master class in writing adventure stories.
Yeah, I really learned a ton, and you're right. Everyone from Bill Clinton and Dolly Parton to nobodies like me.
I wasn't going to put it that way. Glad I was being more delicate there.
Well, he always says that what he looks for is someone who can write a good scene, and I think, and he just read a short story of mine and thought that I could write, could write a good scene. So that's why he gave me the chance, and
well,
I did. Yeah,
it's done a lot of good. So good for you that you did that. I wanted to ask you about partnership. We talked about protagonists, and we've talked about writing a good villain, a good antagonist, but most of you, I think all of you, have engaged in some sort of a partnership. I know, Andrew, that to make your book work, Ethan has to team up with his sister's friend, and Claire, certainly, your ranger, she's got to work within the ranger culture in the park. So do you? And also you can introduce romance, or at least a hint of romance when you have relationships. So how much fun was that for you? Do you want to talk to us a little bit about how you envisioned her whole community?
I think you're still muted, Claire.
I'm back on, sorry.
There you are.
Yeah, I have always had, I will say that way back when, I always had interest in romance. I never wrote romance novels, but my first novel had more of a romance at its core. And so I think that's just something that interests me. And I'm not saying that these two characters will end up going that direction, but I think there was a fondness and also this kind of just back and forth that I wanted to be a little bit snappy and a little bit like contentious at times. And I wanted their relationship to feel real. I think any story really rests on the power, a good story, I think, rests on the power of its relationship, because that's how people kind of relate to storytelling and to each other. And so for me, it was always going to be a partnership. It just almost was the first organic part of the novel for me. It came before anything else, was that I wanted to have these two characters working together, and one person's kind of in their comfort zone but has their own issues, and then the other person is coming off like a bad experience or a job change, and so they both feel a little bit out of sorts. So they both have to get through something, and they need each other to get through it. And I think having a female protagonist, I wanted her to be strong. I mean, I definitely wanted that to be a core of who she was and be tough, but also realize that it's okay to be vulnerable, and it's okay to ask for help or need help, or have someone who adds something, who adds value to your experience and to your knowledge. And so I think exploring that just became really fun. And I just hope that in future, with a series or with a mystery, I think it's important that the characters continue to change. So that's one challenge for me looking forward. I mean, there's certainly an arc for both of these characters in this novel. And going forward, I'm trying to figure out, I don't want to just keep beating her up repeatedly in the books to come. So it's something that will take a lot of thought as I plan out the next one.
Well, being a ranger, she's necessarily in a hierarchical structure. There's an authoritarian sort of thing that goes on. So, it's true when anybody's working in some sort of an agency, sometimes the conflict comes in from within the agency rather than necessarily, with a purported villain or something. So I thought you did that really well. Her trying to work with the ranger who wasn't necessarily sympathetic to her or that culture, I thought really made it interesting. Richard, you brought in somebody, a guy, I love this description, Scott Crockett, a stand-up guy nursing a broken heart out fishing alone. I mean, and there he is suddenly, he's going to be introduced as helping Carla. So I like that she isn't going to probably be able to navigate this awful thing that's happening to her without some kind of help.
Yeah, it was a little tongue in cheek. I was having a bit of fun with this idea. It's sort of a male fantasy. There's this guy, he's 45 years old, just got divorced, very lonely, sitting in his boat alone, anchored out here off one of our islands at night, feeling sorry for himself. And this beautiful, sexually reckless cocktail waitress literally floats into his life. It's like I could take a show of hands, every man in the room who's had that fantasy. Come on, admit it, And so it's almost a preposterous premise. But thrillers are often based on some, I don't know, pretty far-fetched ideas, and that's as far-fetched as I could imagine. So yes, and so I think going along with what Claire was saying, that characters have to make decisions for the characters to be interesting. We watch them make decisions and we measure ourselves against the decisions they make. And Scott, the character Scott, he's just a working guy, carpenter, has to decide whether or not he's going to help this woman who is just obviously nothing but trouble. He says somewhere in one of the interiors that he knew women often came with a difficult baggage, but this one should have her own container barge. It's just a silly comment describing, and he knows it. And so he has to make a decision whether or not he's going to get involved. And then Carla, of course, herself has to make the big decision at the end of the book, a moral decision. So I think that's a big part of character development.
Well, it's certainly true that, characters get to decide if they want to be part of the story or not. I mean, that works. So, Robert, you have somebody, let's see, Eli Stone, a jazz club owner, kind of enters into the story to help out Liza in her quest. I mean, I think all of you are working towards seeking justice of one sort or another. And maybe every thriller has to have, do you think every thriller has to have a moral core? I'm digressing, but, or can they just be for fun and everybody can be awful?
I do think moral cores, so much of crime fiction is we are trying to work through the justice and injustice of this world, and even when we see things happening where it doesn't happen right in real life, we are hoping that in our fiction we can find some good results or some different results. But at the same time, there are people who break the mold, and that's why those stories stand out as well.
I know you're interested in the moral core and justice. I'm thinking ahead to Thursday when I'm talking to an author who has written a total swashbuckler. There is zero moral core. I mean, it's just all really fun. And I think that's one of the great things about thrillers is it allows so many different, kinds of stories and, and diversity within it. It's really great. Patrick and I have so much enjoyed talking to such a variety of authors over Zoom, which, to be honest, we never would have had this conversation at the Poison Pen. It's very unlikely that the four of you would have, somehow materialized in Scottsdale on any given night. So Zoom has really allowed us to do some remarkable things. Patrick, what would you like to add to that?
I wanted to ask Robert about your podcast. And I also read that you were the runner-up in the Eleanor Taylor Bland Memorial Prize. I think I got that right. Yeah. And wasn't the winner Yasmin Ango? Did you have her on your show yet?
We are working on it, probably
Oh, she's great.
later on next year. Yeah, amazing. And her book, Her Name is Night, deserved to win that and many more awards. Absolutely amazing. And yeah, I was one of the runners.
With Rachel Housel Hall.
We had an event with her and Rachel Housel Hall
that
that was
fun.
really, in fact, Patrick, I think, did that event. Didn't you, Patrick?
We did.
Was
We
I
kind of
part of it?
we tag teamed on it. You
Did we?
started it and I
Okay.
finished it. Yeah. So your podcast, tell us a little bit about that.
There's this amazing group of people founded by Walter Mosley, Kelly Garrett, and Gigi Pondian, known as the Crime Writers of Color. And a couple of years ago, I became a part of it. It's just a loose association of about 300 crime writers of color where we are just supporting each other and cheering each other on. And when I became a part of the group, I said, hey, I can do a podcast. And so we've been podcasting now for about a year and a half. And it's just my joy to be able to present these amazing writers to the world and the stories that they're telling.
Is Manuel Ramos still up in Denver? Do you know him?
You know, I have heard of him, and we have mutual friends, but we have never met our face to face.
He'd be great to be on your show. And Sean Cosby. Sean Cosby too.
Sean Cosby, Sean's been on the show, and Manuel is in the group as well. Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah,
Patrick?
let me check.
I think we've explored the basic concepts that I had here, ending with a search for justice, which was the last question I was going to ask.
Well, let's see. I put out my net for questions. Quick question about names, character names. You know, they're so important. And when I heard Richard, did I get the name right? Cosmo D'Angelo, is that right?
Yes.
That's a fantastic name. Can you guys talk about character names? Have you ever written a whole chunk of text and said, you know what, she's not a Nancy, she's an Amanda, you know, or something like that, and done a global change? Talk about names, anybody.
I did change the name of the other character we just talked about. His name now in the book is Scott Crockett. He's an ordinary guy. But for some reason, in the short story version of it 10 years ago, his name was Sebastian. And, you know, it just one of those names, it was too Baroque for the character. You know, it sounds like something from a romance novel or the Lord of the Manor or something, but not, I mean, I've worked in construction for 40 years and I never worked with anybody named Sebastian. I'll tell you that. So I changed it to Scott. You know.
How about you, Andrew?
You know, I don't know where my names come from. Just kind of whatever feels right. If it's a random character, I'll often, you know, look to my bookshelf and just, you know, put together a couple author names or something. And for main characters, I do give it some thought, but I just sort of work through, well, does this sound good together? Does the first and last name sound good together? The main character of my book is Ethan Lockhart, which I thought just sounded like a good name.
A lot of them have like, you know, Jack Reacher, Pike Logan, you know, you don't see like, you know, Myron Worms or something like that as an action hero name. What about you, Claire?
Yeah, names are really important for me. I will go through a long list before something feels right. And oftentimes I'll write a whole manuscript and be like, that just doesn't feel right. And I'll do find and replace. It's hard to say, like with this one, it's Felicity Harland and Ferdinand Huxley, but he goes by Hux and she goes by Harland. And like my agent, my editor kept referring to her as Felicity. And I was like, no, that's not, we're not going to go by her first name. It's her last name. So it's interesting how like strongly I feel about names. I don't know where that comes from. I think side characters I pull from oftentimes family, and somebody will pop up and be like, ooh, that wasn't very flattering. It'll be like a murder suspect or just somebody who's, I don't know, kind of nasty, but I don't do that intentionally. I'm just like, see, I honored you in my book with a little character for you. But it is what it is.
How about you,
And
Robert?
Robert, what about you?
One of the themes in my book is what happens to a dream deferred. Langston Hughes, the great poet, asked that question, and he answered it by asking if it sags like a heavy load or does it just explode. And so what I have in this book is 3 people with deferred dreams, and you're wondering what's going to happen to those dreams, to the point that Langston Brown, who is the wrongfully convicted man, I named him Langston as a nod to Langston Hughes.
That's a wonderful answer. You know what? I have got scrabblings that are taking all the paint off the outside of my door from really determined puppies. So I'm going to let Patrick wind this one up because I really don't want to repaint my office door. Thank you both, I mean, all of you, for a really fascinating conversation. And let me wish you a very happy holiday. And Patrick will finish you off. So good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Barb.
Thanks. All right, now the real fun can begin. Okay. Let's see, let me just gather the books together here. This has been a lot of fun, guys. It's always interesting to get a group of writers together and hear their different perspectives and different approaches. One of the questions that's come in over the Facebook is just a basic question about, you know, who are some of your favorite writers, or who are some of the writers that inspire you? Richard, do you want to kick us off as he takes a sip? Sorry.
Yeah, recently I read Walter Mosley's collection, An Awkward Black Man, collection of short stories, and I love short stories, and I thought those were fantastic. And also his very early collection called Always Outnumbered, Always Outgunned.
I love it.
Yeah, in the 90s, I think, and when he was a much younger writer. So I like Walter Mosley's work very much. But at the same time, I mean, I read, right now I'm reading Dickens' The Old Curiosity Shop, you know. So I read contemporary writers and very old writers back and forth. I even have a sort of a book club here. We call it the Pub Chat Group. We meet in bars and talk about books once a month. And we won't read anything that's less than 100 years old or newer than 100 years old. Just because I missed all that. I didn't go to college until I was 40 years old. So I didn't have any kind of literary background. So now I'm trying to catch up and read Chekhov and all the things that I should have read a long time ago.
Andrew, how about you?
You know, I think that I read a great variety. In particular for the book that we're talking about, I think my main influences were Dennis Lehane and Lee Child and Elmore Leonard. Dennis Lehane and Elmore Leonard, in terms of their protagonists, aren't always, you know, the police or the private detective, but rather criminals, you know, especially Elmore Leonard, you know.
Right.
And then Lee Child, just in terms of the action, and I kind of wanted to create a sort of really tough protagonist in this kind of like Dennis Lehane-esque noir world. But I do read a lot, wide variety. Richard was talking about older books. I've really been on a Alexander Dumas kick lately, and listening to audiobooks of The Three Musketeers and its sequels, which are all just a tremendous amount of fun and great description and great adventure. And so that's kind of something I'm really into right now.
Cool. Claire?
Yeah, I was going to say Dennis Lehane too. I've always admired his writing, and I love Lee Child. I listened to a couple interviews now where he says he just writes as if the headlights are in front of him. So he, you know, that calms me because I'm not much of an outline writer. So I enjoy his books for the spontaneity of it. And yeah, I veer into other genres too. I mean, Stephen King has always been a big influence on me for sure. And I've been reading more recently, Max Brooks. I've been really enjoying his books. He writes sci-fi. I think the common theme for me is I just love to be riveted. And that can be any genre. I just really like to escape into a book. And I think that's really informed my style more than anything else.
Robert?
When it comes to this book, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is represented very well right from the beginning with my protagonist living underground. It's just drawing upon Ellison's Invisible Man. But my favorite writer right now is Leonard Pitts Jr., who Pulitzer Prize winner journalist, but he also writes novels anywhere from crime fiction to novels about World War II. And I just love his writing.
Wow. Sounds great. I was reading on your, I think it was on your podcast maybe, or on your website, you mentioned, and this is going to segue into just a general question to all of you about, you know, advice for aspiring writers who are feeling like, you know, they don't feel like they can do it or break through. I remember, Robert, on your, I think it was on the website, you wrote an essay about, okay, when can I call myself a writer? And I think you had published a couple of nonfiction books. but you still at heart didn't consider yourself a writer. I don't want to paraphrase you, but can you tell that story, and then we can open it up to maybe advice for aspiring writers?
Yeah, I've always seen myself as a reader. I love books. I live in the world of books. And for the last 20 years, I've been writing a lot. I just didn't think of it as writing because it was nonfiction, it was problem solving, it was communicating. And so, yeah, I've written 4 nonfiction books under my real name, but it wasn't until I started writing this book that I finally owned what I do as I write. It's one of the ways I communicate. It's one of the ways I process. But it never had been a way that I was identifying myself. Who am I? I'm also a writer. And this book helped me find that identity, that this is a part of who I am. I write.
And did somebody make that comment where you kind of said, oh, yeah, I am?
I think it was just, I don't think anybody made that comment to me more than I realized if I'm sitting down and spending hours putting words on a page, then I don't know what else you would call this.
By definition, that is writing.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And how about just some words of advice for aspiring writers? You want to kick us off, Robert, and then we'll go around.
I don't think I'm the one to give advice.
Stick with it. Don't quit.
You know what I would say? Just listen to a lot of writers. I mean, I love writing podcasts, and just the more you can hear other people talk about writing, just the more you pick up. And so for me, it's just, there's a fire hose of writers out there talking, and just go drink from that.
All right. Thank you. Richard, you teach, right? Up in Alaska?
I have for many years, part-time. I never quit my day job, which was in construction, but I have taught for years and years.
What words of advice do you have for people that are trying to jumpstart their creative lives, get into writing?
That's a tough one. I think that the people are so different. I mean, every writer. One of the things that I had a great opportunity to do here in Alaska for 18 years was help organize the Kachemak Bay Writers Conference, which was a wonderful gathering every June. And so I got to meet hundreds of writers over the years there. And, it's just every new writer has got his or her own set of problems or challenges. And I don't find any catch-all phrase except to say, write what you wonder about. I think the most frequent mistake I see is people who want to set out and they know exactly what they want to say. For fiction writing, I think that's a catastrophe. I think Claire was just talking about the E.L. Doctorow quote, where you can write, you can drive 100 miles in the dark. You only have to see 100 feet in front of you with your headlights, and that's the way I write. Because of course I wrote short stories, which you could write completely blind with no essay, no outlines or anything like that. And so I mean, I think it's good that you don't know where you're going, but that's a hard thing. It's kind of like a Zen thing, you should don't know what you're doing and you'll know what you're doing or something. I would hate to hear that myself, but that's all I have to say to anyone else.
What about you, Claire? Do you have any words of wisdom to impart?
I find writing really hard, and I think for me, like nothing has been very super smooth sailing. I mean, it may seem so. I don't know. Like for me, my journey has been stops and starts and lots of frustration and moments of complete, wanting to give up or feeling like I wasn't good enough. It's a lot of doubt and just, but I think what it comes down to is I really love it. And so I just come back to it. And at the end of the day, like if I'm enjoying it, then the rest doesn't seem to matter quite as much. And if there comes a time where I don't enjoy it, then that's a different story. But if you enjoy it and you're interested in writing, then just by writing and getting into it and doing it when you can and exploring, you'll get better at it. And I think that's what happened for me.
Do you find, especially in these last, these trying couple of years, especially, that having that creative outlet has been, kind of a godsend,
For me, absolutely. Yeah. I think, yes, it has been an interesting time recently. And for me to be at my best, it's important to have a creative outlet. I'm really grateful for that. It's a big part of who I am. And I think for a lot of people, it's something worth exploring, even if you think you're not like a creative person. Like I think it's just a good muscle to flex.
It's interesting, over the years, I've been here for 25 years, and Barbara has been 32 in the book biz. We've both interviewed hundreds of writers, at this time, and everybody has a slightly different story to tell, different way of looking at the world. It's very, very interesting. And when I pose that kind of question, I get a lot of, I don't know. I just do it, I just do it. Ian Rankin, who wrote the Scottish crime writer who writes the Jack Rebus series. One of the things that he said that really stuck with me is that, through his character Rebus, he's able to kind of work out for himself, problems and things that are bothering him, and having Reacher work them out on the page helps him work them out, which I thought was kind of an interesting insight. Andrew, what do you have to say for aspiring writers? Any words of advice?
I agree with what everyone said. I think one thing is to keep in mind that the writing itself should have its own reward, that you should enjoy writing. If you want to be a writer because you want to have a bestseller, but you don't actually like the writing process, I think that's, maybe the wrong motivation. I think, and I agree that writing is hard. It's challenging. It takes perseverance. You have lots of setbacks, lots of rejections. For every success, there's probably 10 or more setbacks, that kind of thing. But for me, I really just love to write. And what I can tell that I get grumpy when I'm not writing. I don't get grumpy about a book not getting published or a story not getting published. And what I get grumpy is I don't have time to write. So I think the writing itself has to be its own reward. And of course, I want to get published. I want everyone to read my books, but you can't. There's a lot that you can't. There's a lot that's outside of your ability, or outside of your your power to influence. But what you can control is the writing, and so you have to enjoy the writing. And I think, and you take your successes and really enjoy them, because the rejections and the setbacks outnumber the successes for sure. So when you do have a success, really just embrace it and try to let it fill you up and motivate you for more.
Right. Well, let me just see if there's a final question, and then we'll take her in for landing. Let's see. Oh, apparently I blew Ian Rankin's protagonist's name. Somebody's saying John Rebus. Yes. I don't know what I said, but that's the correct name. I think I may have said Jack Rebus. John Rebus is right. Yes. Just as a final question here, somebody made a comment about what a great job Crooked Lane does with their covers. Just the aesthetics are really nice, and all four of your books are wonderful examples of that.
Yeah, look at that. That's amazing.
Yeah, that is a sweet cover. So there are these two. And then I will go to, yeah, all four of these are really sharp. Did you all have much insight into it, or opinion, or did they ask you, or did you just kind of go with what they offered?
I had an interesting experience. The cover of my book came, the first draft of it that they showed me, it was the same picture. It was a lovely picture. There's a woman facing a small boat harbor, and which is central to the story. But in the original version that they sent, it was the Aurora Borealis was in the picture, the Northern Lights, and there was snow on the dock, and the gal was wearing a big heavy parka. It was clearly a winter scene. But the story takes place over about 36 hours in June in Alaska. There's no darkness, there's no snow, there's none of that. So I wrote them back, and they were very gracious. I don't know how they do it. In fact, honestly, I don't know if that is a photo or a painting or drawing. I don't know how they made that thing, but they took out all the snow and put her in some summer clothes, and it looks great. That was a weird thing. But they're very nice people to work with.
Very evocative. Yeah.
Wonderful people, Madeline and Melissa and Matt, all of them there.
Yeah. Well, everybody, thanks. Sorry to run a little bit late here, but I appreciate you spending the time tonight, and congratulations to all four of you on the publication of your new books. Richard Chiapponi, The Hunger of Crows. Andrew Bourelle, 48 Hours to Kill. That is such a cool cover. Awesome. Then we got Robert Justice, They Can't Take Your Name.
Beautiful cover.
Yep. And Claire Kells, Vanishing Edge. Beautiful. Thanks so much, guys. We really appreciate it.
Thank you,
Hope to
Patrick.
see you. Hope to see you here in the desert at some point in the future.
So I got Vanishing Edge today from my local bookstore here in Homer, and Andrew and Robert's books are on order, so they'll get here eventually. So I'm looking forward to reading all these.
Oh,
I spent
thank you,
time
Richard.
in national parks too. Katmai National Park is a great fishing spot. I spend my summers fishing for trout there, so I'm looking forward to
Great.
reading Vanishing Edge.
Awesome.
Thank you, Patrick. Thanks for your help.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a great night.
Thank you,
See you
Patrick.
soon.
Thank you.